Good morning, everyone. My name is Claudio. On behalf of Art Basel, I would like to welcome you to this Conversations panel entitled Museums in Austerity. I want to thank the Absolute Art Bureau for helping us making all the videos, the footage of these conversations online so even a broader audience can watch them. And I also want to thank András, who has been moderating a lot of panels and is always a great help and support for our whole program, actually. And now I want to hand over the microphone to you, and thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, yes, to Art Basel. It's a really wonderful aspect of this fair that we get to have discussions on like really serious topics, although today's is maybe more serious than usual. And thank you to the Absolute Art Bureau, which is also very appropriate because we'll be talking about private funding of artistic activities. So thank you to the Absolute Company for that. And especially to all of you for turning out on this absolutely beautiful, pristine summer day. It really shows commitment to come into a conversation about what is admittedly not an easy subject, museums in a time of austerity. So I applaud you for your true dedication to the future of our field. This is really a crucial topic, especially here in Europe. I think it's fair to say that nothing less than the future of our collecting and exhibiting institutions is at stake. And along with it, the sources of critical validation, social discourse, validation in general, that is not just important in and of itself, but is also, among other things, critically important for all the commercial activity that happens outside of these walls or beyond this audience. The commercial art world depends very, very heavily and in a complex way on these institutions. Joining us here today are representatives of 3 institutions from 3 countries, which it's fair to say have been particularly hurt in this recent crisis, which now seems to have been dragging on forever. And they are Suzanne Cotter in the middle, director of the Serralves Museum in Porto in Portugal, Marina Fokidis to my right, who is with the Kunsthalle Athena in Athens and is also a magazine editor and writer, but they all write and they're all brilliant, and I'll say more about them in a minute. And Agustín Pérez Rubio, who not long ago resigned his position. I think it was only 3 or 4 months ago.
4 months.
In the Contemporary Art Museum in Castilla y León. The person who came after you resigned already as well, so that tells you something about that. I'll say more about them in a minute, but please give them a hand of applause in advance for all their thoughts. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fair to say that we are living in a very strange time. I think it's a tale of 2 art worlds. On the one hand, I think it's fairly clear that the commercial side of the art world is doing very well indeed, and we're happy about that. But the other side of the art world, particularly smaller and mid-sized museums, and particularly here in Europe, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of struggle. Museums around Europe are feeling the cutbacks, which in some cases have been quite drastic. And in this respect, it's also a kind of dual reality geographically. If you go to the United States, just 3 years ago, we had a panel discussion here in Basel about the crisis, which was really at the bottom of the crisis in the US. And I remember the director of the Whitney Museum sitting next to 3 European directors. The European directors were like, crisis? What crisis? We're doing fine. The French institutions actually got more money in the beginning. And poor Adam Weinberg from the Whitney was really struggling because he had just furloughed half his staff and really had to do some very difficult things. But back in the United States, things have really popped back pretty much to normal. Endowments are back. Museums are extending their hours. MoMA has just opened 7 days a week. The Met has opened 7 days a week. Acquisitions are happening. New wings are opening. In some other parts of the world as well, China in particular, 1,000 museums are being built. The Gulf continues after some delays with their projects. But here in Europe, things are very, very difficult indeed, and this phase of austerity is certainly going to last for a while. Now, I want to make very clear that although we have sitting with us 3 people from the southern tier of Europe, Greece, Portugal, Spain, their situation is merely the most emblematic, the most, actually, I don't want to use the word ideal, but it's the worst example of what can happen when things go wrong. But one of the interesting aspects of our situation that even countries which are fairly wealthy, like the United Kingdom, and even countries which have had a historic commitment to art support, like the Netherlands and France, are now experiencing a great deal of pain. What makes the situation further quite critical is that this does not simply appear to be a cyclical event. Many of us, and we'll talk about this, have a perception that this particular crisis has ushered in an even bigger change, a more systemic change, which has to do with the rethinking or questioning of the role of the state in contemporary art, in art in general, in culture in general. So there's a kind of large shift in the status quo taking place, and what's being questioned is whether support for the arts is a core responsibility of the state or not. I think it's fair to say that European institutions were not particularly prepared for the most part for this. It was a long time coming, but I think now there's a lot of scrambling. It's also fair to say that the implications are unclear. And there's one more, I think, even more troubling context behind this, which is politics. Throughout the 20th century, cultural institutions have been agents of progressivism, of social transparency, of open societies, of social progress. And yet some parts of Europe, particularly towards the east, including my home original birthplace of Hungary, are sliding back into political extremism, inequality, and cultural institutions are now, in some cases, not particularly tolerated by the political leadership. There have been notable cases of directors being removed from their posts. So we're quite worried that this is not just an economic crisis for institutions, but an ideological and political crisis as well, as authoritarian governments eye these institutions. So we have a lot to complain about, but please don't worry. We're not just going to spend this whole day complaining. We can obviously, you can all, I told my panelists they can't bring their handkerchiefs. We're not going to cry here on the stage. And the way I'd like to frame this conversation today is not to talk only about what has been lost, but perhaps also to talk about, more importantly, about what might be gained, what we can learn from this crisis. Will the crisis precipitate positive changes in institutional behavior? Can it accelerate certain transitions which we can all agree perhaps were necessary for cultural institutions? Can it make institutions more responsive to their audiences and their publics? Can it be a catalyst in a process where we untether institutions from state bureaucracies? Can it catalyze perhaps a new era of private philanthropy and generosity towards culture? A subject that always interests me. Can it lead to more cooperation and less replication of effort in the museum sphere? And can it teach us to advocate better for these institutions and make a case for them in a situation where there are so many competing priorities? So I think the frame that I'd like to have for this conversation is how can we emerge from this stronger? And what is it that in your experiences that we can take away from this that might help other institutions as well? So we'll talk, many of you have been coming to these panels for a while, so the way this goes is we'll talk a little bit, everybody gets to say a few words at the beginning, then we'll chat for a while, and then there'll be time for questions. I promise you that. And what I'd like to do is start with Suzanne. You're probably relatively among your two peers here in the best, strongest situation, insofar as you have a job, a very good one. You have a job too, but it's a very small institution.
I have a job too, independent job.
But not an institutional
Thank
job.
God.
An institution to run. I mean, sometimes that's, be careful what you ask for, but anyway, you're Australian-born, spent a lot of your career in London, Whitechapel, Hayward. You've done some extraordinary curating, including the Sharjah Biennial. And for those of you who don't know the Serralves Museum, this is an extraordinary, gorgeous, beautiful building opened in 1999, surrounded by a gigantic park full of sculptures and incredible landscapes. It's really a destination and a very important institution in its own environment. It's also, in some ways, a very lucky institution in that it was set up to have a measure of independence from the state because of a certain situation in Portugal. And it's also an institution that's relied heavily on exhibitions and collaborations with institutions abroad. So, what have you learned so far from Austerity?
Yes, well, thanks very much, András. First of all, it's great to be here to talk about this subject, but I have to let many of you know, or those of you who won't know, that I've only recently arrived in Portugal. So
That is true.
I'm speaking here on this panel with a great degree of humility because I'm learning a lot every day about my new institution and also the context in which I'm working. And it coincides with this moment of economic crisis, which is also a moment, I think, of great national social depression, understandably, and I think it's something that's shared across Europe. I don't think it's restricted to the southern part of the European continent and beyond. But what have I learned? Well, many things. I mean, it is true. There are sort of two little qualifiers I'd like to add before I sort of give my comment. One is that Serralves, I'm not only very lucky to be the director of a beautiful museum in an extraordinary place in the north of Portugal, I'm also very fortunate to become, hopefully, part of a history of an institution that was very prescient and very visionary from the outset, in that the impulse to create a museum of contemporary art, at the time a national museum of contemporary art in Portugal, really arose out of a post-revolutionary moment in the country. It was not surprisingly part of a push for sort of it was a moment of creation, a sort of a new moment of creation and self-creation for a society, and so it was a moment of aspiration. But I think it was also driven by people who understood history and understood politics and understood the risks and the potential dangers of ideology when it becomes associated with culture. And they could look at neighboring countries, but also could learn from their own history. So from the outset and from the moment of its inauguration and before, when the foundation that was created in order to build the museum and create the whole situation we currently have now, it was with in mind the model of mixing a sort of the private with the public. So it was never premised on the idea of 100% dependence on the state. So that was a very good thing, and I think we're cushioned by that vision now in the current situation.
What is your budget, if I may ask?
You may ask, but I'm not going to tell you.
Okay, that's how private you are.
No, we're not that private. I'm still, I just don't want to sort of talk about it because I may.
Fair enough.
Yes. No, we're not that private. Things are sort of published in the newspaper.
Right.
It's a very transparent
Okay.
organization. But let's put it this way, it's been funded traditionally, or certainly until recently, by the state at a percentage of 40%.
Okay.
And the rest of the money comes from private support through founders of the institution, but also sponsorship, so money that is raised and money and income that's generated. So we have a very active team who are generating income through sort of commercial activity, hires, all the usual things. So that 60% isn't just, here's the private money, it's also entrepreneurial, as I think most institutions are now functioning, certainly in the UK, I know, and in many other parts of the world. So that's one thing. So we're kind of cushioned from that, but nevertheless, a 40% dependence, 40% budget dependence on the state is a significant amount of money, and when that is cut, as it has been cut, at the moment, this year we understand it to have been cut by 30%, but it may be cut even further. We will not know until possibly the end of the year. It's a significant amount.
That's a 20% cut in your overall budget.
Exactly.
15-20%.
And it could be more.
Yeah.
So that's, that affects us hugely, one. The other thing I wanted to say, and we can talk more about that, just as a kind of qualifier, was you, in the beginning, András, you were talking about the commercial art world and the market sort of thriving and the institutions suffering, which is true. But in a country like Portugal, I can't speak for Spain or Greece, the commercial world isn't thriving either. The whole artistic community is suffering because it's, I think, being part of a smaller country and a relatively smaller community, even though part of Europe and part of a sort of global discussion and conversation around contemporary art production or cultural production, it's very, it's still a community that's very interdependent. So I think what I'm feeling, and one of the things I'm learning and feeling very strongly, is the need to think of ourselves as part of an ecosystem where, we're an ecological landscape in which support for artists in terms of production comes through the private sector, particularly through the galleries, that can also receive a kind of endorsement and validation, be given a sort of broader perspective by the institution that can then give confidence to collectors and private collectors, etc., as well as all of the other educational mission that one has. So they were the two sort of just brief things. The third thing I wanted to say, really, which was in response to your invitation to speak today, was that, for me, and I think for many of my peers and people working not only in the visual arts, but in the cultural community in general, one of our greatest concerns is this one of ideology and the symbolic value of state support. So we can say, okay, we're living through a time of urgency, which introduces certain necessities, but that state of urgency and emergency has now been existing for a number of years, and we're saying we're not coming out of this quickly. It's heralding a very new and different moment, as part of that discussion, culture is, as it so often is being instrumentalized as something which is a luxury item. It's something of an indulgence. It's an excess that can be easily trimmed off. But of course, there is certainly in Portugal, what many of us are frustrated about is there's very little discussion about the true value of culture for society, for communities, how culture actually nourishes the future. Culture as an expression of a place, of people, of those people's place in the world. So it's a bigger concern, and we can say, okay, at the moment we have to make the books balance, and I'm not an economist, I can't sort of speak for sort of management of the sort of national budget, but what I worry about is that what is a state of exception becomes the norm.
And for you, when you feel this sort of public seal of approval no longer being given to the museum, how does that translate into your everyday challenges? I mean, how do you feel that in terms of your interactions with them?
Well, I'm not really feeling it so much because I have the moment I'm not. I mean, I'm talking about, for me, I sort of, a risk, and, I'm also a student of art history, but also necessarily a student of history, and as one grows older, one becomes more and more a student of history, I think, and you sort of see things that have happened, and you worry, you wonder and worry if they could be happening again in your lifetime. And I think we live. I think it's a sort of fragile state that we condition that we constantly live in, politically, and in a society as complex as Europe, with such a complex history as well. So, at the moment, we feel, there are expressions, very strong expressions of support from the Secretary of State for Culture, as much as can be. But I think it's not so much what those expressions of support now. I think it's more the way culture is being pitched at museums. We can't afford that because we really have to think about keeping other people in work. But culture is also education. Culture is also
well, we'll go back
to
at some point in this conversation, we'll loop back to this whole question of how do you make the case when there's so many priorities and what language. I don't think we always had the best language, partly because every year the funding was there. But I want to turn now to you, Marina. You come from a truly difficult environment. I think it's fair to say Greece now is going through yet another cycle of difficulty. You could barely get here to Basel. And in your case, you're in a very different situation. You're in a very small Kunsthalle, not a collecting institution, and yet you're a bit of a hub of creative life in Athens, large openings, big network. And of course, you're also very active as a magazine writer and a critic and so forth. So what's the view from Athens?
Well, yeah, that's true. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a small break. I mean, thank God in Athens we always, or in Greece, we have a beautiful landscape. And very close is always the sea. So when things go wrong, we can always go to the beach. Well, No, it helps. It helps. And I mean, I was talking like when I arrived in Basel, two friends, collectors of mine, just received me by accident in the train station. They're like, "Wow, this train station is so well organized. We can go in every city in Europe within an hour." And I was like, "Yeah, guys, but imagine our port. We can go in every beautiful island that other people need so much time to come." I'm only saying this because one has to think very well where they're operating and from where they're operating to the rest of the world. And I think although we need to, I mean, and I'm one of the first advocates to search for like transnational collaborations, funding, crowdsourcing, yet what we can offer to the rest of the world is our location from where we are right now. So yeah, Greece, as we speak, had only yesterday, had the main national channel shut down.
On the TV,
on the TV, yeah. All of a sudden, yeah.
Good, everybody can go to the museum.
Yeah, I wish. That's what I said. Yeah. I'm one of these, to be, on one hand, pro this situation, because there is a lot of corruption in the public sector and all this. But of course, this is not the way you do things. Just switch off the button. And what the government didn't really consider very well is that people, although they know about the corruption and nothing can anymore get by in Greece in the corruption, thought that this national channel, because it's not private, the TV channel, and because it's funded by them, is their channel. So they thought all of a sudden that we're going to have a severe problematic and manipulated information from now on. So there are tons of people in the street, haven't slept, police, riots, as it's in Turkey and other places, as it was in Stockholm a month ago, and nobody has seen that. So I would agree that we are in extremely urgent times, and this cannot become the norm, because, I mean, it's going to be a war, if it's going to become the norm, a European or world war. But we have to understand that they will be like that, and maybe try to reform our institution towards this situation. I come from a very small institution that we basically funded ourselves, and it was sort of an experiment. We thought we're going to operate for 3 years, independent from the state and from collectors as well, because I will give you very, very fast, if I'm not long, the situation how private and public works in Greece, and that we will make all our funding through crowdsourcing, through donations of like audiences. So what we did is an internet, and I mean, we haven't started the internet, and now 3 years are over, so we're going to change a little bit. But what we thought it was that we will reach out for like big audiences, because that is a way of wealth during this time. So we have, for a very fairly small institution, we're very small, about 4,000 to 5,000 people per opening, and this is huge in Greece. It's like huge, yeah. People feel that is their place, no matter what we show. And we didn't succumb by doing like, we have a small bar and stuff, but it's not an entertaining place. It's not like a club or people come for what they see. So that was nice. So imagine, 4,000 people, it's power.
How big, by the way, is
It's
this?
only 200 square meters. So we have to call the police has to close the roads. So this was our idea. And then the second plan is crowdsourcing. I mean, we see that in Hollywood all the time anyway. I don't know, Kevin Smith with The Last Clock, he resigned from his agency for doing crowdsourcing only. I mean, I think that's
And you're succeeding with that.
Now we are starting this, but we are succeeding with attention, some funding for the exhibitions through donation boxes, and also by the power of people. When the city feels right now, I mean, if there is a petition of people, people say the only institution we want to keep is this one. And this institution is completely independent from politics, state, and collectors. Now we can, I mean, it's been 3 years. And all our team, we're a team of 10 people, work voluntarily, I mean, including myself. We have to do other things to support this institution. But it's a big gain, really, it's a big gain. What was happening in Greece up to now, very fast, is that we have quite some strong collectors, 3 or 4, that have been helping a lot institutions outside Greece, including Whitechapel, Tate, because that gives them a lot of status as well, and we all know that, branding. Not helping so much the in-house institution, also because the museums were very state-oriented. They didn't reach out to them. They weren't welcoming them. And now what they do is, because they feel that they have to do something for their country, is that they open their own institutions. So they become the curators.
I mean, Greece does have a big tradition of philanthropy compared to other countries in Europe, for example, but across the society.
Do you speak for the ancient years or
No. I mean, I'm not an expert in Greece, but I think compared to many countries, even in Western Europe, there's at least some tradition of families that are supporting institutions.
Yeah, it's an exchange, I think. It's an exchange for status, because we are a very small...
Well, philanthropy is always an exchange for status.
No, I think it's a pure exchange for status. Because we are a small country, people want to be heard. So, no, there is no tradition for philanthropy within the state. And the museum also have been used to operate only by state funding, without asking people, and very limited programs, very political, like you know very well in Spain, and so it didn't help. With the exception of Dakis Ioannou, that did some fantastic work for Greece in a period that there was no museums, no institutions, no galleries. Basically educated people about contemporary art in his benefit, and he did it in his own style back then because he had to do his own institution. There were nobody to collaborate. One of the reasons why I'm into contemporary art is because I saw an exhibition in 1990, you know, with very... But then what happened is other Greek people imitated him without taking in consideration that time changes and they have to help in a more collaborative. We don't know how to collaborate. The way people trust in, let's say, the galleries on what to buy and stuff, they don't trust in somebody else's opinion. And also, with their money, they trust very well in their money, and good for them that they have them. They think they can also become the programmers. So what is going to happen in the end, very fast, is like Greece is going to become something like, for them, the lobby of a gallery, the waiting room to go in a gallery, or mocha examples, or... And I think this is maybe something that we should discuss, because you were saying earlier, very accurately, how these museums are sort of a feeding source for the market. But we have to think maybe Also, we have to think this relationship.
Right. I think that sorting
Yeah.
out the issues around philanthropy, I mean, we're coping, I mean, I live in the United States, and it's a daily concern of where you draw the lines. And
Of course.
so here, not only are the same concerns valid, but you actually have to invent the system.
Exactly.
And learn these rules, which are very difficult. And so I think we definitely want to get back to this. Agustín, I want to bring you in at this point. You've been very patient. Thank you very much. You two spent the last part of your life in an extraordinary building, in a beautiful institution. I mean, it's a monument to that recent period of affluence and optimism in Spain, this gorgeous contemporary art museum that you ran and where you served also as a curator for a long time. Musak is, which only opened in 2005, and here it is. We're having a great deal of difficulty, and we're not here to recount the history of Musak. It's a collecting institution. It had a very broad mandate, which I assume you shaped, but it describes itself as a place which citizens can inhabit as a place of encounter, a forum for study, research, discussion, analysis, and enjoyment of contemporary art and culture. So one of the issues which in a way you were talking about is it had a very broad definition of what a museum is. That's one of these things we cope with, is how do you get support for this broad idea of the museum. But here you are, moving to New York, independent curator right now, new phase of your life, and obviously coming through quite a challenging period. So what's your view from Spain, and what have you learned from the crisis?
Well, first of all, I would love to thanks a lot for this invitation, but after to talk, you know, or before to talk to more specifically about the Spain and the situation, I would love to acquaint or to point different ideas about this meeting. The first is like, I love to be with you and with these extraordinary partners, but in one sense, museums and austerity, you told before, no, you said, but it's very important to set what kind of crisis, of what kind of austerity we're talking about. It's economical, it's geopolitical, it's about the ideas, it's about exchange. I think that you look into Europe in a very specific geopolitical way. So that's why, because you invite 3 persons, I have to say, and I told you the first day, I miss a lot of like Dutch institution or like a partner, because all of us in this moment in Europe, not only in Europe, are in a very hard difficulties. You know, it's really difficult now about economics and about to develop programs, but also it looks like, it feels like guilty from the center of Europe, looking back, no, the poor countries in the south of Europe, like, oh, poor, now we have to help or something, or like this kind of guiltiness that Mrs. President of Germany, you know, is doing with our economic in these countries. So in one moment, I think it's very important that to share, not to look at Spain, Portugal, or Greece as a only case, or like these countries that now are suffering, because now we can see, even in Turkey, we are talking about you, when you decide to invite us, it was a geopolitical decision. So we have to think, what does it mean? It means that we are talking about politics, you know. It's a pity that this morning we are not talking about art, you know, and what does it mean, art in this sense. But
it's not a forbidden subject.
But on the other hand, I feel really comfortable. I think that we cannot separate this. We are curators, we are human persons, and we are a political persons. In every decision, in every exhibition that Suzanne curate, or Marina, or the text that you write, you are behind this a political, and every artist that you want to work with, there is a political decision behind. So after this, you know, so for me, it's very important to talk also about different aspects that we're talking about, because for one hand, economics are really important. It helps that the people and the welfare will come up, or, you know, and we have more comfortable situation to work with. But it's very important that this is not the most important thing. If the money, if we don't have money, okay, we can define it, but we have ideas. We are a person that we work in culture, and we have different ways to share, to look for, and to exchange. So for me, I don't like always to say that in Spain the problems, also my problem in Museo was not only in the economics, because when the Museo started, it was 6 million euros to work for every year. When I took the position of as a director.
You mean the budget?
The budget, total budget. Collection, building, everything. You know, salaries, it was 6 million. When I took the position of director, it was 4.7. And after 4 years, my budget was 2.1 this year. But even like that, this is not a problem.
dropping.
This year, I left the museum with an amazing Rosa Barba new production, Jetta Vratescu retrospective, Lara Almarsegui, huge installation that it's in Venice Biennial, Alejandra Riera, Apollonia Susternit book. So this is not really the problem of the institutions in Spain. The problem are the structure of these, the political structure, that the government never pay attention to that and to give the freedom and these kind of really the strategies to build up something in between, of course, the state or the regional government in my case, together with the private and to give the audiences the different ways to put everything together. So the problem really, I think, and under my point of view, in my case, it was the political first. I think that there is some corruption in the government, but on the other hand, it's more like the, you know, the government doesn't allow, in my case it was regional, doesn't allow the tools to build up in a most open way the structure, to build in the future situation, because every government are 4 years and they always think in a very short time, you know, and now with this really conservative government that we have, that they are not paying attention with these cuts to the culture. They only wants to, the museum has to be open. And what do you want to be in? Oh, I don't care. Only is to be open. What does it mean this? You know what I mean?
So, I mean, would you go, I mean, the flip side of that, returning to our sort of silver lining frame, is if that has been a chronic problem always, is this a moment of opportunity sort of to end this status quo?
Of course, I think that now is very important in Spain, because the people for culture, we are all of the time talking about economics, but this is not real the problem. The problem is like, for example, if during 4 years that I've been the director of this institution, I was trying to convince my politicians to create a foundation and to do fundraising and to try to get more structural situation at the museum. They didn't allow me. They want to control everything. They want to, you know, that was the problem. And even now, 100% is funded by the regional government. We have only 5% that I knock the door or I try to convince collectors.
What would you say would be a healthy mix of state funding and private funding for museums in Europe? What would you say, I ask this for all of you, what would be a healthy mix? If you have your budget, you have earned income, you have contributed income, you have state support. What would you say would be a healthy mix for the long-term healthy functioning of museums?
Suzanne, you have more or less this kind of situation.
I mean, not your situation, but what you think is the ideal in general.
I think it depends on the size and scale of the institution, because we're talking about museums, but then, I mean, you're not working in a museum, it's not a museum. You don't have
a small institution.
It's an institution, so I don't know, I think it depends, but
I think also one can consider this period as an urgent period, and you know, I would agree with you. I mean, there are not Dutch people around or Norwegians, but there is a particularity in the South Europe, not as a guilty or as a poor, but you know, like people use it not only in the art, but in the politics, so it's sort of good to focus a little bit on this, because they use it as a paradigm, although the problem is spread to the rest of Europe. And I would think that if you think that this is an urgent time, maybe the state can give very little right now, but help, like you say, because that's the problem. It's the same problem in Greece. Because, and this is the corruption I meant, because every government is for 4 years, they just want to please the people around them, the voters. So they don't allow somebody, they don't give the independency to put money for them.
Right.
So maybe it's better if state is out completely.
For example.
I would go more to other states. I would give a very funny example, but it worked. In Greece this year, the gay pride, it was just 3 days ago. And of course, there was no money from the state for the gay pride. I mean, there is no money for pensioners to buy their medicines. So all the embassies from all over the countries gave money. So the gay pride happens in the city.
Interesting.
And that's a way for the arts.
I think the big question is, what does it mean? What is state funding and what is not? Where does the money actually come from? In some ways, it's all like the same money because the state's money is our money and other people's money.
Right.
So I think it's kind of confusing. But one of the things that occurs to me is that, recognizing, I think the unsustainability of sort of majority state funding for cultural institutions going forward in the future, and thinking about different models where the state's involvement could take other forms. I think some sort of base level of support, which I think reinforces this, is an expression of the symbolic value and the intrinsic value of culture for the society, the constituents that the government or the state represents, one. But two, thinking more in a systemic way, like what sort of infrastructure should one be encouraging? And I think that's an infrastructure in terms of philanthropy and giving. Right. So, the question of benefits or tax benefits or encouragement. But I think also something that's very, very important to me is how might the state support a sort of refreshing and a constant renewal of the institution through the support of young thinkers, young curators, young artists, and the people who really will be shaping and creating the institution as it goes forward into the future.
Have any of your countries in the last 3 years instated new tax incentives for private support?
No. For example, in Spain, we never got an important law to, for example, collectors or philanthropists to reduce tax. And during the last 4 years, all of associations, because the good thing that in Spain now, we have Association of Directors of Museum, Arte, Associations of Art Critics, Artists Association, everyone is asking for that. And could you imagine that the conservative right wing, during the votations and the elections, they had these as a part of their statement, and they never did. Right. So could you imagine, this is a very important thing in the middle of the crisis, because one of the most weird things that maybe Marina also told is about some collectors. Now in Spain, Spanish collectors are acquiring pieces from artists that has galleries in Spain just next to, but they are going to Germany or to UK to get the piece because they don't pay 21% tax. So that's why it's not only museums. We have to open the window. We are talking, and Suzanne said, artists, curators, collectors, galleries, we are all in the same, we are creating contemporary ideas and things, and we have to exchange. So it's very important for the national governments to have this very wide view, because always it's how to help the sector, because it's not only the museum, because of course, now in Spain, Reina Sofia, of course, they are doing an amazing program, and now Joao are doing really well, and they have still some money, but it's not only the icons. Of course, that Serralves is an icon for Portugal. Nobody from the government will take out because it's an icon. The problem is just this. The problems are the small institutions that helps the young curator or the small artist that, for example, I can tell you more than 5-6 cases for a young artist in Spain that got a grant from Museo, and now they are in all of the biennials and places. So this is important.
Well, I want to build on this. First of all, I think we've talked about a lot of really important stuff already, but I do want to get us to this place of making the case. I mean, you're all, in a way, making the case, but I think maybe what would be interesting even for this audience is, at the end of the day, you talked about the art ecology and the importance of non-profit institutions, non-commercial institutions in this ecology. Now, there are many politicians who might say there are many industries that we run perfectly well on a for-profit basis. clothing, whatever, food, it's in the simplest terms possible. How would you explain why it is important to sustain the non-commercial side of the art world? I know it sounds like a trick question, but I mean, really, how do you explain to people who aren't necessarily art experts why it's critical for there to be a non-commercial element to the art system? And what is the unique contribution that you can give?
First of all, is independency.
Yes.
Because you're not
from what?
Independence from
the
commerce. You're not trying to sell something. You are seeing something that it's in the genesis. It's like being bought. There is risk, independency, and you don't trying to survive by this product. Art is not a product in that case. It's a process. And so I think independence and new things through risk, new things can come up, new ideas and can come up. That's why I was
But a politician might say, look at Apple Computer. There's plenty of innovation in the private sector. What kind of innovation is unique to the non-profit side of the art world that the gallery system couldn't provide? I'm just playing devil's advocate, but I do want to...
Very fast, Apple Computer starts with a task. They have to make something innovative. They have to make something innovative that sells. And artists express themselves, or artists express themselves among all of us as more, let's say, sensitive individuals, not with a task to convince anybody. We just throw the stone and we see what happens.
Does that argument work in Portugal?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I think independence is a very important word, but I think for me, I was thinking also this question of disinterestedness, which is related to that. So it's not about pure transaction, because a lot of our life has become extremely transactional. We'll take this money away from you now because we have to balance the budget somewhere else, but then you never get that money back. You have sponsorship. The nature of sponsorship, I think, has become less philanthropic and more a transaction, almost like a commercial transaction where the institution is a sort of a little bit sort of hostage to the needs of another entity. So I think this question of disinterestedness and freedom and sort of it's a space for, a cultural institution should be spaces for aspiration and not for demagogy, not for ideology. And I think, you say everything's political, but I think there's sort of different forms of politics. It's not, I don't think it should be about politics with a capital P, but it's a sort of enactment. Somehow this independence or free space can create it can impact and create a different kind of constituency building that can impact politics.
So, these are all beautiful sentiments, but I presume that when you go to government officials, this is not what you say. Or is it?
Well, there must be a way, that's what I was saying about crowdsourcing, to get rid of the government officials.
Or private.
Or even private.
What are the words that unlock the support?
I would say that if I would reach out bigger audiences, and I would say if the money that goes to an institution is our money, to find a sustainable way that there is an exchange and not a transaction of funds without depending to 1, 2, 3, or 4 people, politicians or philanthropists.
Right.
This is a very interesting thing because, Marina before, she put a really important thing, and it's about the common, I don't know if in English, lo común, the common. Now in these democracies, in incipient democracies that we have, the people is on the streets. This is something that it was really amazing on 15 on May in Spain. So the people, the citizens understand that this is part of all of us. That's why the public money, it's also our money. It are my tax, your tax, also the old people. So now these kind of ideas like crowdfunding or to exchange things in between, like I give you this, you give me the other one. This is a very important moment because when there is now the big money to develop things, the small movements in between this kind of citizenness, to understand that we are part of ciudadanía, like a cityness, like a human citizens, but also a political in the case that we have how can I say, like, we have the doubt and we have the will to fight for the things that we believe. You know, maybe it's very to come back for the 60s and 70s, but I feel sometimes in all of these demonstrations and all of these situations and meetings with cultural people, we are sometimes in a very similar situation.
In Boston, when we recently had a bombing, the Museum of Fine Arts decided to stay open all day, and people flocked to the museum. I mean, are you finding in Europe that the museum has this kind of a function as a kind of refuge, or as
they should? We have. We're talking about numbers. We just last weekend in Porto at Serralves, we had this annual event which is called Serralves Festa, and it was initially it was the 10th anniversary. It's basically Serralves having a party. It's a free event, and where the entire sort of institution, the museum, the park, everything is open for 40 hours non-stop, and it's free. And we over that 40-hour period, we had 90,000, more than 90,000 people come, and it was programmed. There are events happening, every sort of public event. But what we've noticed, for example, is, and you know, it's a very, very tough situation for many people in Portugal at the moment. But on Sunday mornings, the entrance to the museum and the park is free. And the figure for attendance for Sundays since the beginning of this year has doubled in that time.
That's great.
Just to say people want this and they need it, and I think it's a very persuasive argument. It's a need, and it fulfills
that's what
something.
Anybody would understand. Let me quickly check. Are there questions? Put your hand up if you have questions. Good. Because then I can have a question. Here at Art Basel, we have a number of commercial sponsors. This is the sort of mecca of corporate philanthropy, if you will, corporate sponsorship. Have you had an experience with that? Is that a constituency that you're trying to reach out to? Are companies in your target range for trying to get support? And what are your concerns about that? And what are your successes with that, if any?
During last 2 years, I tried, for example, to do a very similar situation with the wineries, with you know, the important wines that we have in Castilla y León. And the most important idea is to find, you know, this balance in between commercial thing and also a public museum, you know. For what reason this brand or this commercial sponsor wants to be into, you know. So for me, the most important is to find the perfect situation and also to understand why he wants to give this money into culture, and no, it is like a kind of advertisement only to that behind this there is really like a cultural you know, challenge, and they want to put this money into culture for one reason, like they believe that this money is not only to give back on the advertisement.
And are you finding those kinds of people?
It's not very easy, I have to say, in Spain. On the map of view, it was not really easy in a context of Castilla y León, because I think that they need even more and more education about contemporary art. Sometimes some people look the contemporary art still with some taboos or whatever. Maybe for a big museums like Reina Sofia or Prado, I'm sure. So, but it's quite hard to find sometimes the balance. But I don't think that we have to refuse, you know. I was telling before that I believe in this common ground, you know. So in this common, I have my arms open to all of these different kinds, but we have to find this balance that sometimes is not easy. What are you thinking?
Well, you know, it's something, I've come into a situation, as I said earlier, that was sort of a rather extraordinary model, I think, for European institutions, and as part of an extraordinary history as well. And I am benefiting from the fact that we have in place a sort of fabulous structure of support from the corporate world and from from societies and entrepreneurial enterprises in Portugal, and it's really amazing because there's a sense of commitment that in fact is not so transactional in nature. It's a real philanthropy, and it's an expression of real belief in the institution and in culture.
Is it different from what your previous job was? Through the Guggenheim, you were involved at the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
Is it different than in the sort of US and UK style philanthropy?
Yeah, I haven't encountered it before because I was working for many years in the UK, which I think many of you here would be aware of, sort of has undergone an extraordinary transformation in terms of the way it thinks about funding culture. Led by some sort of extraordinary cultural agents such as Nicholas Curator and others. But the US is another model, as you were saying, and then my involvement, with the Guggenheim sort of introduced me to a completely different way of thinking. Here, it's something else again. It's people who are from a place, who have invested in it in terms of their businesses. It involves, often there's a very personal relationship, and the CEOs or the chairs of the boards of these companies are actually from Porto, or they're from the north of Portugal. So there's a real sense of belonging, and I think that term, when you're asking about what is it that you talk about when you want to advocate for cultural institutions, for museums or art centers, I think that this sense of it's community but belonging is really important.
I agree.
And I think that's both local, and then that's also what is your sense of belonging within the world. So it's belonging but also aspiration. And I think that we benefit, and I hope that that will continue. I mean, it's nothing due to me at all. I have a sort of extraordinary director general and sort of wonderful board and people who've actually put enabled the situation I've entered into. But I hope it will continue. But there's a real, it's an absolute commitment. It's a very unusual thing. I've not encountered it before.
Still nobody with a question, because then I'll ask one big question that will lead us towards the end of the conversation. I mean, we all seem to agree that this is not just a little dip, but this is a new normal that's emerging.
Yeah.
So, and that some sort of, significant restructuring is ahead. In that situation, what are some of the, some of the things that museums will have to give up, that perhaps they can hand over to another institution? What is the most important change that they have to make, or sacrifice that they have to make? And what is it that they cannot give up?
Yeah. Well, in the case of Greece, that right now we have some we have some big European funding for museums. It's a special program. And unfortunately, we have 2 state museums that they're expanding, or they had to do, and now it's the time they're expanding their space to really big, but nobody knows what it's going to be hosted inside there or how they're going to program. I think that museums should give up their space, like in square meters, and maybe in the case of Greece, because we have these important collections, also collections. They have to give their money in programming.
No, give up.
In the state of that's a different.
No, give up collections. I think that the idea is
collecting.
No collecting. I think that, for example, looking back in my institution when I was the director, I think that the new situation is like we cannot produce exhibitions for 4,000 square meters every 3 months.
Yeah, exactly.
So now. The quality has to be really like high quality of production and showing really good art and in a very theoretical way. The only problem is that now, for example, the exhibitions are not only 3 months, are 6 months. And maybe the new step, it will be to put or to show the collection more than to produce temporary exhibitions. This is something that is happening right now.
Money in the programming.
So the money of the programming, it will be less, and maybe you are not doing every 6 months like 5 shows. You will do 2.
But really good ones.
But very good ones. And the rest of the space, maybe you have, and you will work a lot with the collection because it's something that belongs to you, also belongs to the community, and also there is a lot of ideas to work about how to show a collection. You know, also I think it's interesting to invite young curators to develop new discourses into the collection, something like that. But I don't think that to me is this collecting. I'm not completely agree because maybe it will happen in some institutions. It is happening in my institution, but even when I had no money, even I try to collect in a different way, to produce and later to exchange.
You're not ready to give up collecting.
Yeah, no.
No, the collection actually is a sort of primary sort of focus for me entering into the museum, because it's something that hasn't really been seen very much. It's not really understood. It's a focus for research. It's a focus for new understandings. It's, you know, it's about how we reflect our moment and how that reflection becomes a part of a history. So I think collections and collecting are very important, but it's difficult to say. I don't want to give up anything. But if I agree, I think the sense of perhaps thinking about the ratio of quantity, quality, where quality should absolutely prevail. In terms of what we really should do, I think museums, and I know that museums are doing this, they have to rethink what it means to be a museum and how you function. Yeah. And just to bring this conversation back around to what drives us all, and what we talked about very early on, it's art and the production of art and our encounter with art and how we understand that. And I think we have to, it's understanding the way art is produced now and what our expectations are of that encounter. That's what we have to think about, and how the museum can function in addressing that. So I think we have to rethink, should be constantly rethinking the museum.
And maybe facilitate more people seeing that, exactly what you were describing, audiences as well, again.
Yeah.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground here. I just want to sort of by way of summary say, I think what you heard here today is that this is not just about Southern Europe. This is all of Europe, and indeed the implications are for all museums everywhere. This is not just about money, but it's about the status of art in society and what level of social significance we accord to culture. It's not just about policy and money, but it's about a new relationship to programming and the audience. And it's not just bad news, but also a new opportunity to rethink the museum. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
convinced they
coming.
can only €5.
Thank you. Thanks, András.